Thanks, Martin, and nice to sort of see you all this morning. Yeah, so I'm going to talk. The speakers this morning have set up my talk quite nicely about how we tension rewilding against other approaches to nature conservation and the dire need for nature recovery in this country, given that we're one of the worst places in the world for the state of nature. So I'm going to address the difference between restoration and rewilding and how that's, I think at the moment, causing some issues, which I think we can get around and actually allow them to work in a complementary fashion. A little bit about myself. I'm at the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology and have been for longer than I care to admit. I've been working on habitat restoration for, I think, about 30 years now, with both direct restoration of things like calcareous or chalk grasslands, but also working a lot on farmland and how we can reintroduce nature into those areas. And I realise I've been working on rewilding for quite a long time too. Keith Kirby mentioned the report we worked with him on for what, as it was in those days, English Nature, about 20 years ago. And I think it's fair to say I was somewhat skeptical in those days. I've gradually over the years become much less skeptical and actually quite an advocate now for rewilding, which I hope you'll pick up during this talk. And I'd like as well to acknowledge my colleagues who've contributed to this talk, especially Natalie Petrelli, who worked on a paper which is in review at the moment on looking at this complementary aspect of restoration rewilding, which I'll talk about this morning. First of all, some pictures. So this is a site in Cambridgeshire, which a study which my colleague Rich Broughton worked on, not for 60 years or so, he's not that old, but he's done a lot of work in analysing how this has developed over time using remote sensing. There's those funny blue and red pictures you can see on the right showing how canopy has developed over the years. But basically this was an arable field about 60 odd years ago. It was abandoned. It's next to the National Nature Reserve of Monkswood. And over that time, it's developed very nicely into your classic close canopy oak woodland with, it'd be very hard to tell it apart from the adjacent ancient woodland, or old woodland, I should say. This is another area which Rich has looked at and I've helped him with, way away from Cambridgeshire up near Hull. And this hasn't been abandoned for quite so long. This was agricultural grassland about 33 years ago, but has been abandoned since then. And over that time, there's no hint of woodland developing, but what we've got is we describe as a shrubland, grassland, wetland mosaic. The reason we've not got woodland here is because it's far from woodland seed sources, I think 20 or even more kilometers away from any existing woodland. But over that time, we've got this mosaic being created, and it's become a haven for quite a range of animal species, including a large increase in songbirds, got wetland birds and raptors coming into the site. And think about the human side, it's become an area where a lot of the local community like to wander and observe wildlife. So not woodland, but certainly something of value to nature. This is a restoration site, one of which we're studying in a project we call Rest Rico, where we're looking at successive restoration in various habitats across the country. And this is a classic restoration approach. It was these were a set of arable fields about 15 or so years ago. They've been sown with wildflower seed and green hay as well, which is where you cut grass from existing grasslands and spread it on your restoration sites. And as you can see, this has developed into a nice species-rich grassland in quite rapid time. After 15 years, it's looking pretty good. And that rather odd diagram on the right you can see there is just showing on the bottom the wildflower plants we've got there, and on the top the pollinator species that are using those. What this is showing, we've got not just the plants are coming back, but we've got a nice complex pollinator web and other types of interactions going on. So this is to show you a range of outcomes from rewilding, i.e. natural regeneration, and more classic restoration where we set the system on a path we want to achieve. And I don't think anyone would disagree that all three of those outcomes are highly to be desired in any landscape. So how do we balance them up? Well, let's think a bit more about what's restoration, what's rewilding. In academic circles, there's been a bit of a debate about this. Some say, well, it's all the same thing, isn't it? So why do we even contrast? But there are lots of difference both in what we do, what the ambition is, and how it's seen by both policymakers and other aspects of the community. And I'll address that in the talk today. So restoration, there's a ecological restoration, which brings together academics and practitioners on restoration. And although they might disagree with my take home from this, they very much focus on the idea of restoring particular target communities, native ecosystems, they call them. So it's very much that restoration is targeted. You take an area of land, you see what you think was there beforehand or what you want to achieve, which may be related to somewhere else in the landscape, and really focus your activities on getting towards that. So this set of pictures shows on the top level degraded sites which have been degraded by mining, coral being trawled, or arable agriculture. There's a reference at the bottom where this is what we want to achieve, native forest, coral reef, or a hay meadow. And we put our restoration activities on a path that by planting the certain plants we want, creating structures we want, like artificial reefs, putting soil back or stripping away highly fertile soil, a great range of methods which have been developed over the last few decades to get as rapidly as possible the target community we want. And as has already been described today, rewilding has quite different ideas about it. And as Alistair mentioned, there's quite a lot of different ways of describing rewilding. This is one which I think works quite well, facilitating the development of self-sustaining, self-organizing and resilient ecosystems shaped by natural processes. This just shows a photograph of somewhere near us where there's a bit of debate. I don't want to mention who owns the land because it's a bit controversial, but a bit of a debate about whether this land as it came out of farming should be restored straight back to chalk grassland, which probably was what it was before, or natural processes should dominate. And in this area, natural processes are dominating. You see it's not really looking like a chalk grassland. So it really emphasizes that difference between the two approaches. So to go into a bit more detail about why restoration and rewilding are different, there's this rather complicated table I'll whiz through a bit. And this is somewhat a caricature of the differences, but I think they are valid and relevant too. So I've already talked about the historical benchmarks, sort of trying to get back to something we had in the recent past, and which in this country often relates to heritage, what was the farming, traditional farming in a landscape, etc. And this relevance is really high for restoration. We're trying to get back to something we had fairly recently. Rewilding with that open-ended aspect that's much less important. This rather complicated term, fidelity to taxonomic precedent, so I can't even say that, it's so complicated. But the idea here is, are we trying to achieve a certain set of species in a certain area? And that is very strong in restoration, where we have target communities and we actually assess success in terms of what species we have there. Has already been described, rewilding, that is much of less of an issue. It's more about getting something in place which is functioning and which conserves biodiversity in the broader sense. Because of this, the predictability of what's going to happen in the system as we restore tends to be very high. In fact, that's really a dominant aspect of that. That predictability is much lower in rewilding, where we're not quite sure where we're going, as already been pointed out. That is part of the joy of rewilding. Management commitment over time is really, especially in this country, very high for restoration, where we're trying often to restore traditionally farm type landscapes or communities, and so that really is about a continuous approach to management. Whereas rewilding has been mentioned by a few of the speakers this morning. We don't maybe necessarily stop that straight off, but we certainly aim to taper that down to allow those natural processes to take over. Translocations or adding species to the system, very important for restoration, where we're very much targeted on particular species composition. For rewilding, we may well do that, but it's more about functions in the system rather than those particular species. And that relates to this next point about taxonomic substitutions. What that means is we may, in rewilding, put in species which aren't even native, say, like the European bison, but which are felt to fill a role which is important in that rewilded ecosystem. But restoration, for that very reason, tends to avoid that approach. Environmentally driven system transformation, sorry, these terribly technical phrases, but what that is talking about is, do we let the environment to drive what happens in the system, or are we very much focused on controlling the environment? And so restoration, we tend to resist that. So we start off with a very fertile soil. We tend to try to reduce that fertility so we can get our heathland or chalk grassland back. Whereas rewilding, we may be more open to letting the environment dominate and take us where it will. Again, for similar logic, novel ecosystems which are comprised of species which haven't traditionally or historically or even paleoecologically been found together. In restoration, we really resist that because we're trying to get back to something from the recent past. In rewilding, that may be much more accepted, and that's an interesting emerging area. Already been mentioned, costs. Restoration, because of this really controlled way we want to get back to something from the past, the costs can be quite high with buying seed in, our management, etc. of the site. Rewilding, we can really reduce those costs by letting it go where it will. It's already been mentioned, rewilding is very much a large landscape approach. Restoration, often because of the costs, is smaller. We focus on smaller areas. And I think very importantly, restoration has a massive decades-long research history. And so the knowledge base is really, really high here. Rewilding knowledge base in terms of the science is much lower. And that's not a criticism, it's a statement of fact, and something which is really quite interesting in how we think to go forward. What I'd like to emphasize here is both these approaches have strong positives. So rewilding, I'll return to this in a minute. Interestingly, I gave a talk recently to our local community about rewilding, and it was very, very popular. Loads of people turned up to the pub. I can guarantee if I said I was going to give a talk about restoration, there'd been one bloke and his dog there who probably thought I was going to talk about restoration drama. Rewilding really has stimulated a huge amount of interest and debate in an unprecedented way, and that's great. Getting people's attention is important. Already said, cheaper and larger scale than restoration. We don't necessarily need to keep the management going and the funding going, although of course there are opportunity costs. And something we haven't really talked about is future environmental change, climate change, but also other aspects of change, as we will inevitably lose more species from Britain as time goes on. So potential for high resilience as we get these self-organizing communities of plants and animals, which by definition will be more resilient. Restoration, very important in that a lot of the valued habitats and valued species we have are a result of traditional management, especially traditional farming. So we can help and aid species across many habitat types. I've already mentioned chalk grasslands several times. Excuse me. Is relatively predictable, leading to what we've often seen is that local communities and especially policymakers view that very positively. We know what we're going to get. Whereas rewilding is a bit more like Forrest Gump's box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get. That was my terrible American accent, sorry. Thirdly, for restoration, we can get fairly rapid development due to our ability to overcome the environmental constraints I mentioned, but also dispersal. Trees are not going to get there if you're tens of miles away from your woodlands. We can overcome that But I think this is not to say one's better than the other. I emphasize strongly. Each of those approaches requires specific environmental, societal, and cultural context for what we do and where. And I think, as been mentioned by a few people this morning, we really need a portfolio of approaches that target different scales and socio-ecological contexts, i.e. the ecology of the system, but also the people. And so what I'm going to talk about for the rest of the talk is how we consider these two approaches together. So talk about the benefits of integrating restoration with rewilding. And in doing this, I want to consider simple versus complex ecosystems. So that's something we're pursuing in this RestReco project I've mentioned in passing. Both restoration and rewilding can give you fairly simple ecosystems if you're not careful. So on the left, this shows a simple woodland where we've got trees which are all of the same species and same age. You've got very few animal species in there because of that. Is what we call a low complexity. And this leads to a low functioning. By low functioning, I'm talking about ecosystem processes such as the decomposition cycle, carbon capture, water cycle, and various other things going on. And this also leads to a low resilience to future change. If we can get systems which are more complex, which in this forest system, we've got multiple species, multiple ages, we've got a range of different animal species in there, especially look at the different trophic levels. This higher complexity gives us higher resilience. So I'd say overall, that's what we want to get to, not just within ecosystems, but very importantly, across landscapes. And this shows a sort of diagram from a simple to a complex landscape. If you think of the white between these circles as intensive agriculture or even urban systems, up on the top left, we've got a few sites, all of which the same sort of habitat and have a few species in them doing their thing. We can start connecting these up and this allows species to move across the landscapes to replenish each other, to replenish sites as things change and species go extinct. But also we get a resilience in processes across the whole landscape. And very importantly, we've got different habitats here. So those different shades of green represent different habitats. And this is really critical. And the bottom right, we've got a highly connected landscape, lots of different habitats being connected in different ways, stepping stones, corridors, etc. And I think this really adds an extra level to, Tony mentioned the John Lawton idea of bigger, better, more enjoined. I'd say bigger, better, more enjoined, but also more diverse. So we need a greater diversity of habitats across the landscape, which is really important for supporting a range of species. And this is really that complex landscape idea. And what this might look like when we bring restoration together with rewilding. Sorry, I'll put that in a different way. How does bringing together restoration with rewilding address that? Well, this diagram sort of shows the thoughts we've had along this. So on the top, we've got a degraded landscape. It was a forest many years ago, but a lot's been felled. We have the odd little patch of woodland left or few trees left. It's looking pretty rubbish. A restoration approach going down to on the left-hand side. Across this landscape, we start planting a few new woodlands, and those are quite nice where they are, and they work well, but because of funds, etc., we can't really restore across the whole landscape. The rewilding down to the right, we just let natural processes take over, and we get a range of things happening across that area. And that's all well and good, but what might happen is that the regeneration across the landscape may be quite poor because we've got few sources of seed, and we may get a fairly homogeneous, low quality landscape in terms of biodiversity. Of course, we may get a very good one, and that's not to be denied. So each of those can give you outcomes, all of which look quite positive. But the idea of the bottom graph is where we bring restoration and rewilding together. We allow rewilding across most of the landscape, but we have hotspots where we restore, where we plant our woodlands. And this has a number of benefits. So the rewilding in this case, sorry, the restoration in this case, may not be necessarily just woodlands. We could set a number of different sites on different trajectories. So we could plant woodlands in some areas, chalk grasslands in others, heathlands in others. So we set them on different paths. And then rewilding is combined with that to create a dynamic landscape, so we don't get these sort of fixed in aspic things approach, which I think Tony already mentioned. So in doing so, we do reduce the risk of having a static set of restored habitat types or a homogeneous, low-quality rewilded landscape. The other benefit of this is having restored sites set within a rewild landscape is that landscape is softer and more permeable, in the sense that the seed and the animals are able to disperse more easily across that landscape, either through that landscape being more generally permeable, or we've got species in that landscape which actually disperse the seed or help other animals to disperse themselves. And this makes the whole landscape more permeable and allows that rewilding process to go on apace. We don't have that slow process, which might be an issue. So these two combine to allow us to have both target habitats, which might be important for certain aspects of nature conservation, but also that more general rewilded landscape and that diversity of things going across the landscape, which, as I said, is so important for complexity and resilience. So that's the ecological argument for bringing the two together. But also there are other more social and policy aspects of bringing together restoration with rewilding. One is building interest. I already mentioned this huge amount of interest that rewilding has stimulated. And this graph on the right, I did a little analysis the other day of how often rewilding is mentioned in UK newspapers in the last few years compared with nature restoration, or how you want to define it. And you can see on the left, rewilding is mentioned much, much more frequently. Obviously, some of that is negative, but a lot is really, really positive. And so, as I mentioned earlier, rewilding really captures the imagination in a way restoration doesn't. So we can build on this interest overall to boost nature recovery efforts and boost people's interest in and taking part in nature recovery approaches, which isn't just pure rewilding, but triggers broad support for a greater range of approaches. And so we can achieve this nature recovery, these complex, resilient landscapes, which are so critical. And also the more science side of things, as I mentioned, restoration is so much more studied. This is like a graph of the reverse. This is research papers on Web of Science, which is a portal for research papers. So papers which we can find on Web of Science on restoration over the last few years compared with those on rewilding. And you can see a huge many more on restoration. So there's a massive knowledge base on restoration, which I think, as I've already shown, but it can help build that rewilding know-how so we can get that nature recovery in place quickly. And I think one approach to that more specifically is something put forward in a paper a few years ago, was the idea of rewilding, adopting adaptive approaches, whereby rather than just letting rewilding go and see what happens, we set things going, we see how people are responding to what's happening, how things are turning out, are people happy with that, and maybe we intervene and put use a sort of nudge approach to rewilding to set the system on paths which we want. So it's not just to sit back and let it happen, it's getting more involved. And I think the flip side of rewilding providing inspiration for restoration to be bolder and bigger in terms of scale. There's far too much restoration at small scale, doing this field here and there. And as I mentioned already, the idea we're pushing of restoration to focus on ecosystem complexity and ecosystem function, rather than purely considering the identity of the species in that system. So really those two approaches coming together more to build off each other. And finally, in my need, the real need for policy to embrace rewilding, learning from how it's embraced restoration. On the right here, we've got various initiatives, the United Nations Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, the Bonn Challenge, more recently, it's already been mentioned, the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, and there's the EU Nature Restoration Law. They're all hugely focused on traditional restoration. There's a quote for Nature Restoration Law that we need binding restoration targets for specific habitats and species. So it's very much on the traditional restoration approach, less the rewilding. So while restoration is really enshrined in mainstream policy, there's little explicit reference to rewilding. And we need infrastructures and frameworks and agreements and government action to really bring those two agendas together. And to finally go back to what I think was mentioned almost at the start of the first talk this morning, we need different conservation strategies into these whole landscape approaches to really push forward with nature recovery. Thank you very much.
Neil Armachelu, where is that opening picture from?
A National Trust area called Troutbeck up north somewhere, but living in Dorset, I just know it's up north. They wouldn't call it rewilding though, it's just a nice picture. It's where they've reduced grazing.
Neil Armachelu, is Lawton's better, the more complex you referenced?
Talking about was the point that a lot of our nature reserves, or triple SIs, whatever, are in a rubbish state, low condition, etc. So basically making the point that the protected areas we have, we need to look after much better. So I think the complexity argument is on top of all that, and maybe even mean the protected areas need to move on to some new state.
Rob Fuller, thanks for a great talk. Is traditional interventionist conservation a third dimension to the restoration, rewilding framework? Or is it essentially part of restoration? The reason for asking is that many people are likely to be concerned about where species of conservation importance fit into this. I think John Lawton said something like, species make conservation honest.
I agree totally with that last point. We far too much focus on so-called habitat rather than species. But anyway, to answer that point, I think, yeah, if we put that third dimension in, you can consider that you have your protected areas, which are or your areas of high conservation value, which we look after much better than we are doing. You can think of restoration around those sites to provide a bigger area for species of those sort of habitats to expand and maintain themselves, because the trouble with these protected areas are often too small and will suffer from something called the extinction debt. We're going to lose these species if we don't do something better in the wider countryside. But then rewilding can sit around that. You can almost think of it like a dartboard, although that's maybe a rather bad analogy, where we then we rewild around it to allow that sort of softer landscape and a greater range of things to happen, but including the species in these protected areas or high nature conservation value areas can spread out into those. A strong point being that it relates to BNG, that we often have a very static view when it comes to what we think habitat is. So chalk grassland or an acid grassland or a heathland. And in reality, and in a truly wild landscape, these things would merge together and be very hard to tell apart. So I think we want to move towards that. That's something rewilding tells us.
Cameron Goodhead, hi James, you mentioned the lack of knowledge base in rewilding in comparison to restoration. What do you currently see as the biggest evidence gaps that need filling? And how could we realistically change current rewilding projects to assist in filling those gaps in a more scientific manner?
Yeah, so a few of those have been touched on already. I think this process of what natural regeneration will give you is, we often have this vision of this wonderful regenerated landscape full of, I don't know, oak trees, etc. But there's a bit of a concern that if you've got a really depauperate landscape, heavy soils, etc., which have been ploughed for centuries, what are you going to get in any reasonable time? And is there a danger of actually go backwards rather than forwards? So a better understanding of or the different paths you might get under different conditions. I think the grazing area that Keith mentioned is really, really interesting. Um, we recently put in a proposal to try to understand how grazing animals use landscapes in a more real-world condition. So where they've got a greater ability to move around and make their own choices compared with more traditional conservation where they're very, very constrained. What do they do? Where do they go? What impact do they have on the vegetation? What species are they creating habitat for? What species are they moving around? That is a really cool area to try to look at, both for understanding the science of it, but also get an understanding of what your trajectories might look like, and answering that key question, which has come up this morning a lot, of what are appropriate levels of grazing and the mix of grazing animals. Sadly, we didn't get that grant. And that's so I think the flip side, I'm going to criticize the scientific community. They're often not too interested in rewilding because they don't see it as scientifically addressable. And the final part of that question, I think one problem is for trying to look at rewilding in a scientific way is it's large scale and long term. So I think the classic scientific things where we do little experimental areas and see what happens doesn't really address the issue. Even the things we do sometimes where we've got fences up and say, oh, what happens when you have wild grazing versus no grazing? That's a bit bleeding obvious. You get tall vegetation versus short. I think it's more about how these animals use the landscape. So we need to design, science needs to think of ways to address these issues. It's not just the rewilding community. It needs to bring the scientists in. We need to work together.